You can think about responsible AI as this big umbrella of safety guardrails and that we want to bake into a model across different pillars like bias, transparency, privacy, robustness, interpretability, etc.
If you were to poll a sample of 100 people, maybe 60 would say that, yeah, that's problematic. 40 would be like, hey, that's okay. Who decides whether that response is in fact problematic? Is it some shadowy leader that you never meet, or is it you as an engineer, or like who is the decision maker here?
I got to work with machine learning systems research, to AI for accelerating IT operations, to even responsible AI in my final rotation.
Maybe I should have led with this, but where does responsible AI come into what you just described?
How do we make sure that whatever the model outputs actually grounded in real world data and is factually correct? US innovates, EU regulates, China copies.
How far do you think we are from AGI?
Welcome to the Ready Set Do podcast, where we learn from journeys of not experts who are just 2 steps ahead of us.
I'm Naman Pandey, and in this episode, featured not expert is Advitya Gimawat. Advitya has the incredibly unique role of working on responsible AI at Microsoft as a machine learning engineer too. More so than the other episodes that I've put out here, I am incredibly stoked to present what I feel was such a nuanced discussion on the ethics and responsibilities that come with making mass market generative AI products. This is a discussion which is oftentimes super technical and complex, but I believe one that can really change the way that you view and approach generative AI. We discussed the technical foundations of Advitya's career that brought him to this cutting edge of technology where he now lives and breathes, and also go over how GenAI tools by big tech navigate critical concerns such as privacy, ethics, inherent biases that creep into data all the time, apparently, and the aspect that I was most curious about: who are these people that are the actual decision makers when it comes to flagging a response as something that's problematic and or offensive. In keeping with our theme of learning from somebody that's just 2 steps ahead of us instead of an expert, my goal is to highlight the extraordinary role that Advitya is playing as an ML engineer by working on something that is the harbinger of the next era of technology. Indeed, the future is now, old man. This is the Ready Set Do podcast, and to support it, please subscribe to the YouTube channel and or leave me up to a 5-star rating on Spotify. And now, without any further ado, my friends, here's Advitya. Welcome, Advitya.
For having me, Naman. It's great to be on your podcast. I think I came across your videos a couple months back, and honestly, it was just a lot of fun to watch. I kind of love the amount of detail that you covered in the podcast, and like things about both the professional and personal journeys of people, which kind of like made their overall journeys very authentic to me personally, as I got to learn about like people in different fields. So yeah, excited to like chat with you today, and I hope this conversation also brings in comparable value to your audience. So yeah.
So a simple metric that at least I use, maybe it's not the best one out there, is that I just optimize for stuff that I want, really. So with you, I'm really excited to get into what the fascinating world of responsible AI holds, because clearly that's the direction that we're headed. But going back to what you said, it's not something I've heard somebody give that feedback to me, in which you reference that it's both the personal as well as professional side of a guest that comes out. That's not even necessarily something that I try to do, but so that's what makes that feedback really valuable to me, because now I know to explicitly try and do that more often. So really appreciate that call out. And yeah, just to get the ball rolling, do you want to give us a quick and dirty snapshot of your career that kind of got you to this point at Microsoft working with responsible AI?
So my name is Advitya Gimawat. I am currently working as a ML engineer at Microsoft. Currently, I build tools for evaluating large language models. Background, I graduated from UC San Diego, majoring in data science. Since then, I have been working at Microsoft, and it's been a little over 3 years now. For the first 2 years, I was in a rotational program. So it was actually a 2-year rotation program where I worked with 4 different orgs across Microsoft for 6 months each on different kinds of ML projects. I got done with that program summer of last year. And since then, I have been in my current team working on different kinds of responsible AI and AI safety tooling. Initially, I worked on tooling for computer vision models. And this year onwards, it's quite a lot about large language models. So yeah, that's my intro in a nutshell.
Yeah, appreciate that. Love how, actually quick and dirty that was. It's a very delicate balance to strike, which I think you did really well there. I am curious, what were the four divisions that you had to rotate at? That's the first question. And the second was that actually sounds so cool to me. This is not something I've heard that even happens at Big Tech. So I'm also curious how you kind of landed or found that position. If you could touch on both of those.
So, to answer the first part of your question, I got to work over the span of that rotation program in four different orgs. I personally chose to work in four different orgs across Azure because I really wanted to be involved in like different kinds of product lines within Azure and solve different kinds of machine learning
Okay.
problems there. So I got to work with Azure Quality, the Edge and Platform aspect org of it. I also got to work with Azure Data, which kind of like relates to building their data products and product line. So I got to pursue
Mhm.
research there as well. And then my final rotation was with Azure Machine Learning, which actually is related to building the actual ML platform, which companies can use to actually build ML models and productize them and put them to production. In terms of
I see.
how I landed this program, so I actually had done research with a professor for 2.5 years in college, and
Hmm.
they actually had very strong ties with a research lab at Microsoft. So
Ah,
when I was actually searching for jobs, right, I kind of came across this rotation program, and I reached out to the head of that lab just on LinkedIn, introducing myself and saying that I've been working with this professor, and like I know that you have very close academic ties with this research lab. I've been working with them, and I would love to perhaps get a referral or like hop onto an information call. Fortunately, they not only did they know the program, they were actually working with that program actively. It's
oh
We
wow.
had like one or two kind of projects every semester with the program that I then got to be a part of. So not only did they give me a referral, they actually shared my resume internally with the hiring manager of that program, who went on to be my manager when I joined Microsoft. So
Wow.
that kind of experience felt like even more enhanced than a referral, where someone on the inside was actually vouching for me as a potential person that should be interviewed.
Absolutely.
And that
Yeah.
is how I entered the interviewing process. Uh,
Wow.
yeah, it was pretty groundbreaking. And to also kind of elaborate on how I came across this program and things like that. Of course, sure, I was using typical tools like Google and LinkedIn job alerts. But what particularly stood out to me about this program, Naman, is that I couldn't really find any other program of this kind in the industry.
Amazing. And just for some more context, what did you study at University of San Diego?
I actually majored in data science. So,
Okay, data science.
yeah,
Gotcha.
so data science was a new major that got introduced in my college when I was a freshman. So
I
that
see.
is when I kind of got to explore more of it, and I got to be one of the first cohorts of that major at UC San Diego.
And did you have a lot of hands-on experience working with machine learning during your college days, or was more of that happening once after you'd already started your stint at Microsoft?
I do feel pretty grateful, Naman, that not only was the major new, but a lot of the classes were really tailored towards data science and machine learning concepts. A lot
I
of the
see.
required coursework that we would have to take was a combination of math classes, typical CS classes, and pretty
Hmm.
much machine learning classes. We had
Wow. Okay.
dedicated classes to deal with different parts of the machine learning lifecycle, all from like theoretical foundations of data science to practical applications using some basic modules and frameworks to build different machine learning models. I got to take dedicated classes in data engineering, data visualization, analytic systems, cloud technologies, things like that. So, recommender systems, things like that. So,
Hmm.
I really kind of like loved how tailored and specific a lot of the classes were in terms of dealing with different concepts. That is one part of it, of my experience. The other part was that as I look back at my experience, I feel it gave me a pretty solid foundation in terms of how AI practitioners actually build AI in the industry. But I
Gotcha.
particularly would like to emphasize on the word foundation
Hmm.
because things are moving so fast in our industry that I would even like have to be honest with you and say that pretty much all that I learned in my college was very useful foundational knowledge that is now deemed traditional in our industry.
Wow. That's so impactful. Yeah, I mean that makes so much sense. Yeah, and then so from there, yeah, this is so interesting because what I'm envisioning is, yeah, you go to college, you do these really hard courses. They at least they sound very hard to me, even though I do have some background in computer science. I was never as deep into data science and all of those things. Like, so a lot of that is still a black box to me, even though it's really not, because I've actually had some exposure to these technologies, at least to a decent amount, at least. But what I'm getting at is, once you started your rotational program, and then and say I think you referenced towards the end of that, or in the second year, you were exposed to some of the more machine learning oriented stuff at Microsoft. So what was a day in the life for that? Like, what was it like for you to hands on be working at one of the biggest companies in the world and contributing to their artificial intelligence research? Or maybe it wasn't research, but yeah, any thoughts on that?
um, Disclaimer, my experience is going to be likely not the norm, but an exception in the sense that because I got to be a part of that rotation program, my experience was likely quite different from a typical new
Mhm.
grad experience, not just necessarily at Microsoft, but a typical larger tech company as well, for that matter. So in my rotation program, we basically had 4 rotations of 6 months each. So we were doing 6 month long projects. And
Okay.
the dynamic of working there was quite distinctive and interesting at the same time in my personal experience, where we were in kind of like teams of, say, 1 PM, 2 data scientists, 2 engineers from our rotation program. Everyone's a new grad at varying levels of degrees. And we were kind of dealing with 2 stakeholders at the same time. One was
Okay.
the partner team that we might work with, the partner org, for whom we're actually doing the ML project or kind of accelerating ML work for them. And the second stakeholder would be our actual reporting managers or the leadership team of that rotation program itself. So
I
it
see.
was a pretty interesting balance of trying to kind of prioritize what the partner org wants to do, what makes the most sense from a business perspective, and at the same time, how to further our own kind of ambitions in learning, and also kind of making sure that we're kind of getting the kind of projects or work or challenges that we are also looking for. So that would be
Mm.
in terms of like finding our interests among the variety of different kinds of projects that were out there for us to choose from. And then also kind of making sure that we're also learning valuable skills in the process from like a career perspective as well, not just a technical perspective. In terms of the,
What were
Mhm.
Yeah, sorry, what were some of the things that you were actually working on and getting your hands dirty with?
Yeah,
If you can talk about that,
of
that
course,
is.
yeah. So a lot of the technical projects, I got to work with very like different kind of sub problems of machine learning, all from uh, research to AI for accelerating IT operations to even
Mhm.
responsible AI in my final rotation. So I got to work on like both research oriented projects and like production kind of typical software oriented projects as well, from a machine learning perspective. It was all kind of like diversified and all from like publishing papers or presenting at publishing papers and things to even doing like product work or productizing like ML applications or typical ML solutions, for
Okay.
example, for specific domains of problems, to even building different kinds of tooling and infrastructure for other ML practitioners to build better
Mhm.
AI using those tools.
I see.
Um,
That's really helpful. Do you by chance have an example of a product? It not necessarily that you worked on, but just for me to contextualize that something a research that you did around machine learning that then became a product. Maybe something within the Microsoft suite that comes to mind.
So I got to work on a couple sort of research problems and engineering problems. Some of that stuff is already being integrated. Some of that stuff might be in like sort of like a pre-release or beta phase. But probably the closest thing that I can tell you, which is like the closest to release and being out there for external customers as well, is in my final rotation, I got to work on responsible AI tooling for object detection models. And
Okay.
I got to work with the Azure machine learning org there. So back at that time, so this was early 2023, the major platform that was offered by Azure was Azure Machine Learning Studio, which was basically this one-stop shop platform to train your machine learning models and
Right.
like test them and put them to production. The features for related to a model asset in AML Studio was related to responsible AI insights. And there was a responsible AI dashboard integrated there. That responsible AI dashboard is actually also open source on GitHub. So people can also download that locally and play with them and just plug their model and data in and actually get a whole bunch of responsible AI insights related to their model. And there are a whole bunch of models that are supported. So I particularly got to work on object detection models, which for that, we were trying to add in support for different kinds of responsible AI insights for those models. The kinds of insights and tooling that I got to work on and surface were related to adding support for metrics, different kinds of metrics, B, adding support for group-based metric calculations, where users
I
can
see.
be empowered to do their own analyses based on their own domain in terms of choosing different cohorts of data, different categories within their data set, and kind of comparing and performance metrics across those different cohorts of data to do more granular analysis on where failure points are exactly occurring and what kinds of steps or actions might be needed. For example, if the metrics related to objects detected in images are in low light conditions versus like in the mornings, for example, it is possible that the overall performance among those different categories or cohorts of data could be different. That can provide more insight to the user in terms of what kinds of data augmentations do they want to do, or how much do they want to change their training or testing data sets to actually make their model more resilient towards kind of those kinds of say like images tested or those kinds of data points.
Right. Or stuff that has bad lighting and such,
Exactly.
right?
And this is one kind of tooling that I got to integrate now. There were additional
Awesome.
there were additional
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
there were additional insights related to, say, even adding support for saliency maps, in the sense of if you take an image and the model, and you could have, say, like colors superimposed on top of the images to actually see how your model is behaving. What part of the image is the model focusing on more or less when it actually comes to the model making its prediction, so that the user can make sure, in terms of transparency and better interpretability of the behavior of their models, on how their model is actually making the prediction. What part of the image is it focusing on? And is that right or wrong? And there's these different kinds of like charts and visualizations and metrics that I got to kind of work on as well, which also then got released into public preview, which people can sign up and use on the platform as well.
That's awesome. Yeah, I bet that must have felt like a milestone moment for you.
It was pretty groundbreaking for me personally, Naman, because the previous rotations that I got to work on, those were really kind of like early stage AI ideas and
Right. Research heavy, I'm assuming.
and new kinds of projects that we were introducing, which were gradually getting rolled out internally initially before even reaching external customers, right? But in this case, I kind of got to be the closest to production out of any of my other rotations in my personal experience. And so
Right.
directly working with external customers and talking to them and understanding their pain points and accordingly surfacing different kinds of insights and tooling support was a pretty groundbreaking experience in terms of my kind of tooling and product, say, being used by other companies out there.
Awesome. So about that really amazing deep dive that you just gave us, I think most of the technical details definitely tracked by me. All of that makes sense. The part that I'm not 100% sure about is where does or how exactly, and maybe I should have led with this, so that's probably on me, but where does responsible AI come into what you just described? So what you were saying about, the user being able to decide what part of the image to focus on, like the user can tell the model, say we're looking at the picture of I don't know, let's say like a mouse, right? And then the user is able to point out that when you do your analysis, please focus on this little block here which contains the mouse. So that sounds more to me like an image classification type problem. I'm trying to understand your perspective on where the responsible part comes into this.
Is detecting skis, okay? Like a bunch of skis for people who are skiing,
Mhm.
right? So it can be a lot more likely for a model to detect skis which are just flat laying on the ground, which may have people using those skis and which are around snowy conditions, for example.
Mhm.
So it can be very easy to see like the background, like snowy conditions, or say even a person. And then if they have like a long sort of, if there's like a long sort of like thing at the bottom of the person, that's likely a ski. But also, if there are skis that are just kind of leaning against a wall, for example, the other external constraints like snowy conditions where we typically see skis or humans using them are not really shown in an image of standalone skis just leaning against the wall. And so, in that
Mhm.
sense,
Right.
that kind of data, that kind of augmented image can lead to, say, lots of typical inaccuracies in terms of the model being able to detect it, because the model did not focus on the qualities of a ski nearly as much as the environment where skis are more
Mm.
commonly located. In other words, the model basically, the kinds of patterns that the model extracted in its training process wasn't related to the inherent qualities of an object, but more so the qualities of environments where that object is more commonly located.
I see. That's really helpful, and that ties the loop in terms of my understanding of your final project with the rotation. So since you graduated from that program, quote unquote graduated, I know you continued to work on responsible AI still. So at any point did you get to um, dip your toes maybe, or maybe even just dive headfirst into the generative AI side of things as far as responsible AI is concerned? And just for some more context, what I'm getting at is we know that AI can inherently have a lot of biases and all of those things, which it needs, like somebody needs to go in and tell it that, hey, maybe what you're learning from the data is ha- um, having you have this bias, but maybe you shouldn't actually have this bias. So for me, for just an uninitiated layperson, that sounds like it would fall under, or it should probably fall under the responsible AI bucket as well. But I'm curious to hear if that is actually the case, or is that a separate department?
So, kind of answering the question in two parts, related to how my kind of work sort of evolved, where LLMs kind of came in the picture, and kind of
Hmm.
the role of, say, bias, for example, in the overall kind of umbrella of developing responsible AI systems, right? So first, last summer when I kind of got done with the program or sort of graduated and then joined a new team, I was initially working on other computer vision models as well. So broadly, like typical models like for image classification and multi-label classification and things like that as well. Since this year, I basically got looped into building responsible AI tools for large language models, considering the overall priorities of not just like a company necessarily, but just the industry in terms of the
Hmm.
kinds of AI and the kinds of use cases that they want to unlock with these powerful large language models, right? So since this year, I have been working on a lot of tooling around that. And a lot
Okay.
of the tooling around that is, of course, centered on a variety of responsible AI pillars, one of which is bias, which makes a lot of sense, as you correctly highlighted. So the way that I would look at these different sort of concepts like bias or transparency, responsible AI, etc., is that think of responsible AI as a big umbrella term, for example, which just relates
Okay.
to building AI that is safe and reliable and transparent and doesn't encode human bias.
Accurate.
Yeah, accurate
Right.
and does not harm, does not unintentionally harm any users using it, right? Within this broad umbrella of responsible AI, there's definitely a lot of pillars, a lot of sub pillars and branches um, in terms of how do we actualize this. One of the
Mm-hmm.
branches, as you correctly highlighted, is bias. How do we make sure our model does not have bias towards any specific groups of data, or more practically, any specific groups of people across
Mm-hmm.
different kinds of categories, like race or gender or demographic divide
Right.
and things like that, right? So that is also related to how do we make sure that across different parts of the training process, but say especially at the very initial stages, how can we sanitize our data in a way where our data ideally does not encode those kinds of biases? How do we track the performance on a category like bias through different metrics like demographic parity, or kind of testing it on different kinds of bias detection data sets? How do we make sure that
Okay.
the outputs of a model, especially a large language model, is sanitized at all stages of the process, all from the user sending a prompt to the model processing it to the model outputting something, and perhaps additional post-processing steps to make sure that like no bias is really kind of outputted by the model like to the customer. That is one
Mm.
pillar of bias, say, within the responsible AI umbrella. There are a couple additional pillars as well. One of those pillars could be transparency, for example. So, in the
Mm-hmm.
context of LLMs, transparency could mean how do we make sure that whatever the model outputs is actually grounded in real world data and is actually factually correct. An
Mm-hmm.
additional way of doing that and surfacing that for the user could be perhaps making sure that whatever the model outputs has citations around each sentence that it's
Right.
generating to make sure the user can cross check references and what the model is outputting and make sure things are correct,
Yep.
for example. Yet another umbrella could be privacy. How do we make sure that the model ideally is not trained on sensitive data, or if sensitive data got injected into the process, how do we make sure it does not output that at any cost? Another variant of privacy is how do we make sure that the model does not leak its initial system prompts or instruction prompts or any
Mm.
confidential details that the model is not supposed to say. Um,
Wow.
and aside from even privacy or anonymization, making sure that the outputs are kind of sanitized for removing personally identifiable information, even if it might be dealing with
Absolutely.
some kind of customer data. How do we make sure? So another bucket in the umbrella could be robustness. How do we actually test these models across these different pillars, for example? One of the most common kinds of stress testings or attacks against a model could be adversarial attacks, like
Right.
prompt injection attacks, for example, where there might be an adversarial prompt which might want to instruct a model to do something bad. How do we make sure the model does not give into that prompt and does not do something bad
Mhm.
or decline to answer and things like that? And there's very interesting and creative ways, Naman, in which people have tried to like jailbreak models into doing something
Oh, I bet.
that's like
I bet.
steering away from its typical behavior. And so just to
Mhm.
kind of summarize the answer, like you can think about responsible AI as like this big umbrella of safety guardrails and practices that we want to bake into a model across different pillars like bias, transparency, privacy, robustness, interpretability, etc., to really make sure that these models are safe when they go out.
Amazing. That, I mean, just from what you just laid out, I actually have already so many questions in my head. I am having a tough time even, having them pointed down so then I can ask you one by one. So just inspecting the various buckets that you mentioned, I think some of them are fairly cut and dry for me, and I would assume for most people, such as, transparency, for instance, if we pick at that one, it feels fairly obvious to me that I don't know. Maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong, but probably 99% of your average laypersons out there would probably agree that it is a good idea that anytime an LLM says something, there should be a citation that if should they want, they can go and look at that. So I don't think there's a lot of debate on
Depends
that
on the
portion.
context most of the time. I'm just having a
Interesting.
here where if I want a model to just creatively generate some sort of a poem, right? I guess having citations could be like a slightly weird user experience, or I just want a model to say something completely unique. In that sense, the model would
Fair,
struggle to get
fair,
creative. But yeah, you're
fair
definitely
enough.
on the right train of thought here.
Absolutely, no, that's a great call out. Yeah, because if you're having a LLM generate, like a picture of a cat under a night sky,
Yeah.
probably I'm okay not looking at the citation for that. I don't care where it got it from, but that's where we get into the privacy concern, which I know was a big topic recently. At least, I think it was more so related with Gemini, but it really just applies to all LLMs. But I think, oh yeah, Google, I think, was recently in the news for this, where they've been using all available YouTube footage to train their AI video models. And a lot of people had the opinion that that's inherently wrong or that shouldn't happen. And then if we just even stick to the pictures part of it, obviously if you ask an LLM to generate, me talking to you in the sky in the style of Van Gogh, that is probably not original art because it's not giving maybe credit to an artist that should probably deserve credit for that. All of those sticky areas we get into. So I want to examine the privacy aspect of it first, and then maybe we can go into the bias, which is for me at least the biggest hot potato so to speak in this entire arena. So what are your thoughts on, in terms of what I just laid out, where do you personally land on the whole privacy debate around LLMs?
You brought this up, Naman. It is definitely like in the kind of scope, in the sort of timeline of when LLMs came in and their overall training process and their kinds of outputs. It's definitely a long-standing and continued problem, continued challenge, right? Quite interesting where there's definitely, say, like data on the internet that was likely used to train these models, right? And it's possible that likely, explicit permission may not have been taken for these kinds of models. I have also seen, I believe, court cases where I believe certain large news media organizations actually sued some of these model vendors, some of these companies that create
Right,
these large language models for, I'm not even
right.
kidding, I think I've seen in the order of trillions of dollars worth of reparations cited in those initial court cases, saying that there is just
Wow.
a whole bunch of copyrighted data that was likely used
Hmm.
to train these models and things.
Yeah.
So I think there are two things that are sort of broadly happening here, Naman. One, now moving forward, people seem to be much more aware of using copyrighted data and things, say, for the training process. And so I have definitely heard, say, interviews of like senior executives at these companies that are, say, creating some of these models, saying that now they are trying to get explicit permission for training models. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, and so they're making sure that the model is kind of copyrighted, or they're making sure
I
to,
see.
scrub off all the personally identifiable information before training models. And
Right.
an even more effective approach here is that a lot of models are actually now using synthetic data sets to train their models, where they're actually going to say, initially starting at some form of high quality data, like high quality reports, research reports, textbooks, etc., and then actually using them to generate synthetic data sets to then train the model on to sort of like escape or bypass this problem of
Hmm.
explicitly training on this on like copyrighted data. Pillar is that I believe I've also seen, and I might be wrong, but one of these large companies that kind of own like a lot of this video content and audio content and things, they're even starting to roll out programs where even if they have AI features mimicking, for example, the voice of, say, some of these like artists or content reviews, they're still kind of gradually offering them royalties, for example, gradually offering them royalties or kind of like partnering with some initial artists to actually still surface those kinds of features to users. And so because of that, I feel like now the industry is definitely starting to realize the impacts of, just like training on some data or like kind of being more aware of the sensitive of like how sensitive like data could potentially be, right? So those are steps in the right direction. In terms of the stuff that's already been done, right? That is something that I believe it might even go on to, of course, like the legal system and the political system to kind of also decide how to mitigate challenges like these. What kinds of guardrails need to be baked into the model for making sure that that data is not explicitly referenced in the model's output responses, and what kinds of legislation should then get created in the process to kind of mitigate challenges like these. We've, of course, seen like places like the EU kind of driving some regulation in this space. There has been regulation in California, believe an executive order some time back, that have also tried to kind of make progress in this space.
Interesting. Yeah, you can always trust the EU to do any and all regulations, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, I heard about this one sort of meme or catchphrase, Naman, some time back, saying that like US innovates, EU regulates, China copies. There's nothing like good or bad about these rules, in my personal opinion. I personally feel all these rules are kind of like uniquely important in their own terms, in terms of actually democratizing technology, making it impactful. I remember I wrote sometime back in an article that I would say India scales because of its unique kind of qualities. But yeah, it's pretty interesting to see the different roles of these different nature players.
True, yeah. Very true. And maybe this is just my own subjective opinion, but for whatever reason, at least in my head, I find it difficult to separate the role of regulation and just slamming the brakes. That's just what the first vision that comes to my mind when somebody says regulation. So maybe that's on me. But coming back, something that you said really caught my attention was you said that to generate that synthetic data, um, there's documents or textbooks that are being used, and I'm assuming that obviously permission must have been taken from the rightful owners of those things to generate that synthetic data. But what about pictures though? Because don't you run into a fresh set of problems where, like, how do you get synthetic data on pictures? Because even if it is synthetic, it must come from something, right? And if it is, then we're back to the snake almost eating its own tail. So is my understanding right there, or is there a gap there that I'm not aware?
Absolutely on the right track, Naman. These are like, I'm not going to claim to know the answers to all these questions, but these are definitely quite important and complicated questions to answer.
Yeah,
absolutely. There are the most clear answer that I can personally give you, Naman, is that there are certain tricks that can kind of do and use in terms of making sure that the content that they're generating is relatively unique. It's not just on. It's not just about training on diverse data sets or training on open source data sets. So say of like open source images where copyright may not be a problem, for example. There are, of course, huge data sets that have been already created in this process, even a couple decades back, with data sets such as ImageNet, which is supposed to have like a variety of images across different tasks. But even using those data sets and performing different kinds of data augmentations, for example, to generate like other images. And these data augmentations could be as simple as occluding or hiding some pixels on an image. It could be as simple as just changing the color gradient of the images to like all green or grayscale and things like that. And it has been empirically observed that by making even minor data augmentations like hiding pixels, changing the color contrast and gradient, cropping pictures, rotating pictures, etc., these data augmentations have been empirically observed to still really improve a model's training process, not only in terms
Gotcha.
of extracting more diversified patterns and like more well-informed patterns on generating images, but also kind of just coming up with really new and like like really new and other kinds of creative images
Right.
on different kinds
Yeah.
of augmentations that have been fed to the model. That is probably the most clear answer that I can provide you in terms of how
No, yeah.
folks try to bypass these things. Or
No, I appreciate that. I think that's really valuable context, especially around the going into the next here question that I have, which will be around biases. But before I do that, I am curious. A lot of these seem to be just inherently subjects that people, depending on who you ask the question, you might expect to hear different answers. So at companies of scale, big tech companies, how does the decision making work around that? So just to give you probably a really, you know, dumb example that will probably never happen in real life, but say you're working on the LLM of whichever big tech company, you can make your pick, and you found that it does, or it generated a possibly problematic answer to one of your questions that you can see it doing again and again, like on a fairly common basis. Now, if you were to poll a sample of 100 people, maybe 60 would say that, yeah, that's problematic. 40 would be like, hey, that's okay. Who decides whether that response is in fact problematic? Is it some shadowy leader that you never meet, or is it you as an engineer, or like who is the decision maker?
again, really important and complex question here, Naman. But yeah, it's quite important to be addressing this, right? From my personal experience, in these large kinds of tech organizations which deal with training some of these foundation models, work is kind of really divided into various different parts and handled by all
Hmm.
kinds of different teams. When it comes to actually the performance of the models and what it's outputting, a lot of that work can go to the science or measurement kinds of teams that actually work on overall like model performances, say even based on quality. Quality is one of the most fundamental set of performance evaluation criterion, right? Kind of generating say outputs and making sure if those outputs are good or bad or not, right?
Yeah.
Aside from using open source data sets, companies can also have closed source data sets or their own kinds of data augmentations or generations that they might be using. There is a whole suite of kind of teams and area related to red teaming of machine learning models, which is related to actually having a simulated environment where a model is fed with all kinds of adversarial prompts to see how that model behaves,
Wow.
so that those kinds of things can in fact be corrected and kind of supplied back to the model for training process to make sure that these models are really resilient when they're pushed out.
Hmm.
A lot of the work has also been open sourced by companies like Microsoft. Even I believe there's this open source framework called Pyrit, Pyrit, which is this like open source GitHub repository where a former colleague of mine has worked on, which a former colleague of mine has worked on for other users to actually create these kinds of different flows, these different workflows to red team their model, for example. And so there are a variety of these teams that kind of either do like automated testing, scalable testing to get data set, feed it back to the model for improving it. There are
Right.
also potentially teams that can do more boutique testing of these models. There are like a whole bunch of categories, like even inside the field of adversarial attacks, where a lot of where some teams might even do boutique testing in terms of a human physically trying to say like break the model internally to actually learn different kinds of insights from them and trying to really creatively kind of construct prompts and data sets and other things in terms of really monitoring how good and bad the behavior is. There has been a lot of really interesting insight that we've gathered in terms of how the model deals with like data that may not be in English, for example, data that might be prompts that might be structured in the form of mathematical calculations, different kinds of
Right.
types of prompts like role playing, for example, where you're kind of like steering a model to kind of like not do something good under the garb of like being a different person or something. So there's a lot of these like very interesting kinds of testing that happen. Now, with all this being
Interesting.
said, I do want to acknowledge one really interesting point that you raised, Naman, related to, hey, if one image is not okay by 60% people, but okay by 40% people, right? How do we make those determinations?
Within that testing team, right? You're referring to that testing team being the person or the group that's doing the sampling,
Yep,
right?
yep. There are two kinds of broad categories that I envision that this is kind of being dealt with. One, even by choosing typical models on like these large like cloud computing platforms, there is kind of, I'm sure, a lot of safety guardrails baked into these models by default to just be on the safer side. That's a pretty basic but useful heuristic that way. It can compromise
Got it.
performance to some extent as well, but it is possible that companies can make that determination at an initial level that that is probably still okay and not at the adverse cost of outputting something bad. That's one thing. Second, it's also quite likely where users have the flexibility to set different kinds of model parameters for themselves, not just related to how creative or deterministic the model output should
Uh-huh.
be with parameters like temperature, for example, but
Right.
also to not only pick different kinds of like evaluation metrics across measuring these harms, but to also define, say, like different kinds of like thresholds of tolerance that they might have
Right.
towards specific kinds of outputs. Because we really don't want to claim to be the experts here, Naman, in terms of what's good, what's bad.
It's so
That
interesting.
really depends upon
Wow.
culture. To some extent, we want to surface this level of functionality to the users, in my personal opinion, where users can be empowered enough to choose those thresholds for themselves based on their culture and context and the domain of problem that they're dealing with.
How far away do you think we are from that day, though? Because at least from my knowledge, I don't think this exists currently, right?
There are a lot of like there are several not only open source tools but also startups that in my knowledge have gotten created in the space that kind of offer tooling around kind of say evaluating large language models across these different
Gotcha.
criteria and giving that power in the hands of the user. There are tools that do exist, fortunately. A lot of this tooling, however, is also quite new. A lot of
Sorry, sorry, real quick, just to clarify, I meant from the companies that make the LLMs themselves. Like, why is there a need for a third party to make this? Why can't, the Googles of the world make this feature themselves and ship that?
so a couple reasons why that could happen. So one, I think everyone is kind of making tooling around the space, not only the larger companies and the model vendors, but also startups. There can be
Hmm.
differences in terms of course, the speed at which these tools can be built by large companies versus startups. That's one important factor in terms of getting more attention, getting market cap. Two, it can even be related to these companies are building tools that they might even say larger companies can tend to lock, say, users within the same platform, for
Mm.
example, or within like a class
Mm.
of models, right? Where they would work well, they would work great with models that belong to that same company, but not necessarily other models. And that can kind of vary, right? Whereas
Gotcha.
startups or say open source tooling that gets created in this space, that can kind of boast a more versatile sort of more versatile set of usage across different models so that users don't have to get locked into using a particular model from a particular vendor. They can look at the entire span of models that exist in open source by these different model vendors and take a more informed decision for themselves in terms of how to actually bake in these safety practices in their models and how to actually mitigate the costs because this is also very expensive, right? So, say users using smaller models, for example, or using open source models could have, say, even merits for, say, companies or users that are starting out very early in this race and trying to figure things out for themselves in terms of building applications, mitigating costs, and gradually scaling up their usage, right? So, in terms of like what's stopping a company, a large company that's building these models to also build those tools? Nothing. They're already getting created in this space. Startups are also working on
Mhm.
it, which who
Right.
can be faster on an average than larger tech companies. And there are open source tools as well, which to some extent, open source developers could even use for free for doing testing at some scale, right? So there's
Mhm.
different value propositions that are offered with free open source tooling for quick and dirty experimentation to say tools by standalone companies and platforms that ideally are platform agnostic or model agnostic to using large cloud computing platforms, for example, that boast a whole variety of privacy and security guarantees, enterprise guarantees, a lot of compute,
Right.
a lot of the tooling for scalable experimentation and things like that. So there's these different like market sectors and different values offered by each of
Really cool. Yeah, I mean, this whole like I'll use ChatGPT every once in 2 days or whatever, but it's just mind blowing to me. Just the entire absolute universe, or maybe universes that exist behind, just a generative AI as a technology, and really what goes behind that. So, from all of what, from my very again limited knowledge on this subject, I do think what you said about giving the power in the hands of the people, that hey, let me decide how woke or non-woke I need my responses to be. I actually think that is, I don't, at least I cannot think of a better solution to this, because as you said, I do 100% agree with that companies ideally should not have either the right or the power to make those decisions for other people. However, having said that, you can certainly go too far in the other direction. I'm referring to Grok by Twitter, or XAI, which to me it just feels like not a very good product, because it just feels like a gimmick to me. It's just like a toy that people would use to generate stuff that's just offensive, because it's the only place you can do that. So I guess my question to you, and again, I know this has nothing to do with what you do for work. I guess it does have a lot to do with that, but where you work, or who your colleagues are or whatever. But I'm just trying to understand from your perspective, where do you stand on just the scale of where you're trying to be inclusive and helpful, but also accurate. And at what point does that water get muddy, and what can we do, maybe as not just people that build the technology, but also people that use it, to make sure that it's, I guess everybody can't win, but at least it's at least acceptable as a solution that works for most people.
It's a very broad question. So
It is.
I can,
I do
yeah,
agree.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I can try to answer this in kind of, I guess, from two perspectives. One from the user and one from the AI practitioners who are actually developing,
Perfect.
evaluating.
Perfect.
From the user's perspective, one thing I would really like to emphasize on is user feedback. As you rightly pointed out, Naman, um, no one's an expert really at determining like what is right and what is wrong. And so as these new models come, like get released and get tested by real life users on real life use cases, it's really the first waves of user feedback that really guide how these models actually have to be constructed. And I'm really glad that
Hmm.
even the heads of large tech companies have sort of alluded to the importance of getting user feedback, claiming
Okay.
that their products are not perfect at all, but they're really banking on or depending on, say, initial user feedback to better understand how to serve them well. So on the user side, of course, if the user sees something offensive and things like that, there are usually like functionality to, of course, provide user feedback
Yeah.
and things like that. Or kind of course, say like tweak the parameters of a model, as you discussed before, on like what level of tolerance do they want the model
Yeah.
to have and things like that. AI developer side, right? It's a very interesting optimization problem where the user is trying to balance performance quality, safety, computational cost, latency, or the speed at which results are served to the user. So there's these really interesting, just like 4 buckets right off the bat that I try to point out in terms of how the user would actually do these, how the user would actually optimize across all these lines, right? I wouldn't claim that there's a straight answer to this because this is really an optimization problem that AI practitioners would have to figure out for themselves and for the users. But what I can say is that feel the evaluation tooling or whatever tools and platforms that users are using ideally needs to be built in a way which is simple and actionable for users to understand the result and at least draw some actionable conclusions out of them in terms of where do they want to see maximum improvements to their models, comparing different iterations of models across these different metrics, and what kind of makes the most sense for them practically to deploy as a solution. So, in the sense, I feel like I would even argue and steer away from AI and say that this is actually can be deemed as a user experience question in terms of
That's fair.
make sure that the tools that are building brand new user experiences for a relatively brand new set of concepts, which might be foreign to most users, especially the users that are starting out, how do they make sure that user experiences are simple to latch onto, are easy enough for people to enter and try to use them? How do we make sure that the surfaces where those tools are deployed as an entry point are kind of well visible to users and understandable to try some quick and dirty evaluations initially, and then kind of imagine or visualize creating more complex workflows and evaluating across these lines? And how do we make sure that the results are actually very clear to the users in terms of where their models are good, bad, how do they compare against different models, against different parameters, hyperparameters, and what kinds of actionable insights can be explicitly provided to users for them to go back and improve their application based on those results. So there's no straight answer to like how AI practitioners improve this, except like perhaps say the tool makers making sure that the tools are easy to understand and for people to start using them and start onboarding to them more and more, so that these decisions can be taken iteratively. And it is developing these models is obviously an iterative process. There is
for sure
around that.
It almost, what you just laid out almost brings to mind about how, at least in the early days of cybersecurity, and this is still probably true to at least on a fundamental level, but it's the expertise of the people doing the hacking that actually leads to more robust systems. So if you apply that same analogy here, it almost sounds like it's the as the adversarial prompts get better, that will in fact in various, it'll trickle down and make the models also get better, and it'll almost be like a adversarial relationship, but one in which at least this particular, as you said, AI practitioners, they would benefit from that interaction. It's just the balancing act of that, of the power dynamic there, which I think will be really helpful for me to witness and for you to build.
Responsibility on me. Wouldn't claim to do all of that, but yeah.
You should have thought of that before you started doing this or living on this absolute cutting edge of technology that you're in currently. But genuinely, so blown away by all of the, not just the expertise that you bring, but the way you have of breaking down these really complex questions. Like in my head, a lot of these questions don't even make a lot of sense, and I'm just throwing them at you, and yet you're able to somehow cobble together a very well informed, very articulate response. So really appreciate that. Really last question here for you, Advitya, before I let you go. How far do you think we are from AGI? And for our any uninitiated listener, if you could also break down what AGI at least means for you, that would also be really helpful.
I will be very honest with you, Naman. So first, I'm going to talk about, I guess, what I think of AGI and then how far we might be from it and things like that. With you, in my mind, I personally decided to not have an opinion about what AGI is. The reason for doing that is that there's just so much information overload that is happening in today's world with how fast this industry is evolving, that before anything, I just want to soak in all this knowledge and kind of try to capture trends and where things are going rather than jumping into opinions or conclusions. That's just been like a personal sort of like priority of mine in terms of how I
Yeah.
want to look at this. At the same time, I have seen that, of course, AGI has been defined, say, by companies like OpenAI and others as like a really intelligent system that can perform humans or overtake humans in most economically viable tasks.
Exactly.
I feel that definition makes practical sense to me. I'm not sure if that's a comprehensive enough definition because just doing economic tasks isn't like all that human intelligence is about. There's a lot of tenets to that, but it makes practical sense to at least start out with because that is how these model vendors are likely going to get their money back or actually earn profits from the usage of these models, right? A lot of these models, because they're sold to enterprises, it only makes sense that if these models are useful at economically viable tasks, that is how everyone is going to earn a profit. So I feel it's a practical definition. Where AGI is going, how long will it take for us to get there? Very opposing perspectives among like different
Me too.
as well.
Definitely.
In terms of like how important is AI safety for them versus not? How far is it going to be? How do we even tackle problems like climate change in the scope of like as we kind of develop this AGI or kind of like develop models that have like really high electricity consumption and things like that, right? I kind of also wrote about this in one editorial that I had written in like a separate kind of news report a couple weeks or like a month back, where I said that I kind of am not even inclined to distinguish right from wrong in terms of who's right here, who's wrong here, how much time is it going to take. But what I wanted to point out is that AGI is a fluid concept, Naman. This is really the overarching idea of my answer that I'm going to expand upon right now, that AGI is a fluid concept. And because of that, there is pretty much no defined sort of timeline on like when AGI would arrive, or how do we even define what level of AGI has arrived at what point. The reason for that,
interesting.
The definition of AGI, I believe, has also changed over the years, even by these model vendor companies and things like that. If you consider the definitions back in 2018 or before to now and things like that, these definitions have changed. Also, as new models came in and as these large language models came in, understanding of human cognition has really improved in terms of distinguishing between what intelligence can be generated by a computer versus what is truly human intelligence. Even when calculators came in, like say before calculators, doing mathematical calculations was a very important tenet of say measuring human intelligence. After calculators came in, we could think about a broader set of problems to deal with. And so the definition of or our understanding of what it means to be human, what it means to be intelligent, and the different branches of cognition and understanding about the human brain has evolved and improved over the years. And so, as we look at these large language models, how versatile they are in terms of generating content, in terms of writing language with perfect grammar, for example, in terms of generating even like poems or like things that we would deem as creative, but even humans at the back of their mind would take inspiration initially from somewhere and then come up with something and things like that. So our definition of intelligence, cognition, and what it means for a system to be general in all senses of intelligence is fluid, is evolving. And so, because of that, I feel as these new models come in, boasting new capabilities, like our understanding gets refined on like what can these models do? More importantly, what can these models not do? These models like GPT-4 or whatever, they can answer really intelligent questions really well, grounded in real world data, all that. These kinds of models are likely not going to be able to answer if 3307 is a prime number or not.
Oh, interesting.
Turns out,
Really?
turns out that's not the kind of task that it's been built upon. I have seen examples where
That's so interesting. I had no idea. I just assumed it would be okay doing that.
I have seen examples where these kinds of large models, and I'm definitely not looking to badmouth these models by any standard. It's just very
Of course,
to
yeah.
learn about what these models can do, cannot do. And this is all really helpful feedback, even for the model vendors and everyone moving forward, as we all figure this out by ourselves. Where I saw this one prompt, is 3307 a prime number? The response was, oh, 11 can divide it. And this is the answer with the decimal points. And hence it is not a prime number when in fact I believe it was, kind of thing, right? So a
Yeah.
lot of people then also
Huh.
talked about it. One of the conclusions that was raised was that, hey, this model is a next word predictor. It's not designed necessarily for doing mathematical operations of this type or the kinds of
Hmm.
different neural and symbolic elements that will be required to truly understand and operationalize mathematical calculations of this kind is probably not encoded in the model just yet. And so, again, coming back
Hmm.
to your answer, what these models can do, cannot do, how far away are we from different kinds of intelligences, our understanding of it, and so the overall definition of AGI towards, say, economic tasks initially. And I wonder what even comes next after economic tasks. There's got to be something more than that. I feel that this is going to be an evolving field. Obviously, we are going to see a whole lot of developments in the next 5 to 10 years. I do believe there will be lots of developments around like multi LLM setups and agents and these more complex workflows to kind of automate bigger parts of like enterprises and bigger parts of the processes. And we'll gradually get to expand the scope of where humans actually offer value and how humans kind of use these tools.
So cool. That's just that just blows my mind. I actually used to be convinced that um now like the times that we live in are in fact the best time to be alive, and then this whole thing came about with generative AIs, and now I'm like, if there was even a little shadow of a doubt in my mind, it's gone. Like I don't think there has ever been a more exciting time to be alive. Not just in terms of technology, but really what it enables for everyone around the world in so many ways. Technology is in fact such a great leveler, and the ability to leverage it to do what you want is just an ability that just simply didn't exist even 100 years ago from now. So as I mull on that, and the, I don't know, 31 other things that you've left with us here today, Advitya, I'd like to thank you so much for taking the time, um, for not just going over and sharing your expertise, but your deeply rooted insights in terms of not just the work you do, but also what your own feelings are towards all of these really complex topics. And yeah, I think it takes a lot of a genuine interest to have this amount of brevity on these complex topics as such as these. So really, really grateful for your time, and I cannot wait to remain connected and see all the amazing work that I'm sure you'll do in this.
For having me, Naman, and for all the kind and encouraging words. Yeah, I had a lot of fun in this conversation, and I really love the thoughtfulness with which you kind of posed really complicated and long-standing challenges and questions in terms of how we want to kind of look at these things. And that kind of course, like also motivated me to think more deeply about these things literally right now in this conversation. So really appreciate kind of the thoughtfulness that you kind of brought to our conversation. I really hope that some of the stuff that I said, some of our conversations, hopefully provides a similar amount of value to your audience as the rest of your viewers and podcasters did as well. And yeah, definitely like looking forward to kind of also seeing like your next set of podcasts and the next set of people you get to talk to and what I can also learn from them. But yeah, I hope you had fun in this conversation, and I hope that the audience watching this also has fun listening to this.
That brings us to the end of episode 29 of the Ready Set Do podcast. Thank you all for sharing these conversations with those that continue to benefit from them. If you would like to support me, the easiest way to do that is by subscribing to the YouTube channel and or leaving me a pro 5-star rating on Spotify. Catch you all in the next one. New episodes every Wednesday.